Hello everyone, welcome to the Radiance Hub YouTube channel. Today our topic is Metaphysical Poets. As you know, we are dealing with literary terms through MH Abrams books so that information that you get here should be authentic. So, while talking of metaphysical poets, we begin with John Dryden's statement that he made in the work Discourse Concerning Satire. It was published in 1693, and there he talked about John Donne, one of the pioneers of metaphysical poetry, or I must say, the pioneer of metaphysical poetry. So he talks about John Donne and says that he, through his poetry, affects the metaphysics. You understand metaphysics? Something which is beyond physics is metaphysics. So he used it in a derogatory sense to deprecate him, not to appreciate him. So his affecting metaphysics means he employs the terminology and abstruse arguments of the medieval scholastic philosophers. What is abstruse? Something which is difficult to understand. So Dryden says the kind of terminology and the kind of arguments that Donne uses in his poetry is difficult to understand. Further, this particular concern is supported by Samuel Johnson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, when he talks about life of Cowley in the work Lives of Poets. There, Samuel Johnson extended the term metaphysical. So you should remember that when we talk of John Dryden, we should remember this phrase. He used this phrase, affects the metaphysics. When we talk of Samuel Johnson, he used that particular word, metaphysical. Obviously, it was originated from Dryden's statement, but metaphysical word was used for them for the first time by Dr. Samuel Johnson. So in 1779, he extended it and included school of poets in them in the acute and balanced critique that he incorporated, as I have already told you, in Life of Cowley. And here he includes, a group of 17th century poets who, whether or not directly influenced by Donne. See, as we talk of romantic poets, we have, uh, two generations there. In first generation, we have, as by David Edges. In first generation, we have William Blake, S.T. Coleridge, and William Wordsworth. In second generation, we have the poets like John Keats, P.B. Shelley, and that great Byron. We have these all poets, these all were romantics, but obviously they wrote in different manner. So the similar case is here with the metaphysical poets. They are a group of 17th century poets, but not always same. So that's why we are having this statement here, whether or not directly influenced by Donne, employs similar poetic procedures. We'll talk about that. What are the similarities? Which are the criteria by which we include them as metaphysical poets? And even here in metaphysical poetry, we have two categories. One is of secular poetry, and other one is of religious poetry. In secular poetry, we have the poets like Cleveland, Marvell, and Cowley. In religious poetry, we have the poets like Herbert, Vaughan, Crashaw, and Traherne. I hope you are aware of many names, but some are less popular. Cleveland, you understand? Cleveland is used for John Cleveland. And when you talk of Marvell, very well known, Marvell, Andrew Marvell, known for his To His Choir Mistress. Then Cowley, Abraham Cowley, in life of which Samuel Johnson made that statement of metaphysical. Herbert, George Herbert, known as Saint Poet. Then we have Vaughan. Mind it, it is not Vaughan or something like that. It is Vaughan. Henry Vaughan. Then Crashaw, Richard Crashaw. And one more we have in religious poetry is Traherne. He was Thomas Traherne. When you talk of George Herbert, The Temple is famous work by him. A very famous poem, Virtue, is there. The Collar. We'll talk about them later. Now, when we talk of the similarities, the qualities, the properties, the characteristics which bring all of them together, is they had common poetic style. They all used figurative language, and the way they organized their meditative process, the way they use their poetic argument, these all are the qualities which brought them under this term metaphysical poet. Now, when we talk of John Donne, he set the metaphysical mode by writing poems, and obviously, as we know, when you do something different, only then your work is counted, only then you come in the eyes of the people. So was the case with Donne. So he sharply opposed to the rich mellifluousness and the idealized view of human nature and of sexual love, which had constituted a central tradition in Elizabethan poetry. So Elizabethan poetry has a different fervor, has a different flavor. It had rich mellifluousness. What is mellifluousness? This refers to a smooth, sweet, and musical sound, often describing a voice or musical tone that is pleasant to hear. So, something related with euphony, that you want to listen, that pleases you. So, that element was there in Elizabethan poetry that you will not find in John Donne. And idealized view of human nature was there in Elizabethan poetry, but John Donne was realistic, so he was different. And of sexual love, which had constituted a central tradition in his Elizabethan poetry, that was not in that manner there in John Donne. The examples that we are having here of Elizabethan poetry is that of Spenser, Edmund Spenser, the poet who composed The Fairy Queen regarding Queen Elizabeth, and writers of Petrarchan sonnets. I hope you are aware about pioneers of Petrarchan sonnets in England. One is Thomas Wyatt, who brought that form in England, and other one is Earl of Surrey, who actually uh, tried to bring a new format, that is English way of writing sonnet. So their writing were different, and John Donne was writing in a different way. Even when you talk of cavalier poets, the contemporary ones in 17th century, Donne's poems are opposed also to the fluid regular versification of his contemporaries. So cavalier poets were contemporaries to him, and their writing was replete with fluid regular versification. That was not there the case with John Donne. We'll talk about cavalier poets in coming slides. So, what kind of writing John Donne had? He wrote in a diction and a meter modeled on the rough give and take of actual speech. Means a kind of colloquial language he was using. Conversational way, the style that he had, and often organized his poems as an urgent or heated argument with the reluctant mistress or an intuiting friend or God or death or with himself. So, conversational tone is there, and many a times he even talks to himself. So, monologue is there. Many a times you understand that some mistress is there who is being wooed, who is being coaxed. So, and even when she is reluctant, so reluctant mistress or an intuiting friend, or even when he talks to God. If you remember that poem by John Donne, A Hymn to God the Father, where he uses that pun in his name done and the verb done. He employed a subtle and often deliberately outrageous logic. So he does not do that by chance, he does that deliberately. The kind of logic that he uses, and due to which Dr. Samuel Johnson, made that statement that how heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. We'll talk about that. So, when we talk of the characteristics of Donne's poetry, Donne's personality, he was realistic, grounded in reality. He did not have that much, fantasy, ironic at the same time, and sometimes cynical in his treatment of the complexity of human motives. Human motives are very complex. Different people treat them differently, especially in the sexual relationship. Now, when we talk of mood, the kind of mood that he had, even if he could be playful or serious, and the genres in poetry that he dealt, the actual concern that he had, he wrote poetry of love, he wrote religious poetry as well. So, whether he was writing poetry of love or intense religious experience, he always was witty. And that's why, the neoclassical critics and readers sometimes alleged had the allegation on metaphysical poets that they used false wit. But here we find that how Donne was witty, and here comes that particular phrase, metaphysical conceit. Even when we talk of that statement, heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. For understanding that, we'll have to understand metaphysical conceit. That we'll do that later. So, making ingenious use of and what kind of devices he used in his poetry, paradox, pun, and startling parallels in simile and metaphor. So these were the weapons that he used in his writing, the devices. Now I'm giving you some examples from his famous works. One is a poem. The poem itself is known as Go and Catch a Falling Star, and this particular phrase or the statement or the quotation is noteworthy. This poem is also known as song. So go and catch a falling star. And then we have that famous line from The Canonization, where he asserts to his beloved, for God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love. Then we have one famous poem by Donne, The Sun Rising, where the concept of sun is, Ptolemaic. We've talked about Ptolemaic in the Renaissance, how Ptolemy used to believe that sun was, moving. So this statement, busy old fool, unreal is sun. He is calling sun busy old fool because he says that if sun has to move around the world, it should or he should do around a room in which a lover and beloved are there, because they have a different world of themselves. So why should sun you know go for that much work? He should move around the place where a lover and beloved are there. Again, as we talked of John Dryden and Samuel Johnson, in that continuity, we understand that in neoclassic period, most critics and readers regarded them interesting. They appreciated that they were interesting, but at the same time they say it, and they say perversely ingenious and obscure exponents of false wit. We talked about it, how they had allegation of using false wit. In nearly all times, even in the contemporary time of Donne and others, or after them, they had admirers, but actual evaluation, or rather re-evaluation, came after World War First. It means World War First was there in between 1914 to 1918. So after 1918, that re-evaluation elevated Donne, his position, and to a lesser extent Herbert and Marvell. Even George Herbert and Andrew Marvell was also appreciated, but not of that extent as we have for Donne. What happened at that time? There was a work published in 1912 by H.J.C. Grierson. He wrote Introduction to Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century. And this got support and impetus by the great poet and critic of that time in modern literature, T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stephen Eliot. He wrote two essays in their support. One is the Metaphysical Poets, and the other one is Andrew Marvell. Andrew Marvell is the name of the essay by T.S. Eliot here. It was published in 1921. And there he talks, there T.S. Eliot talks how metaphysical poets, they had unification of sensibility. In contrast of which, he talks how the later poets, the poets of later 17th century, they did not have that flavor. They could not have uh, association or unification of sensibility. Rather, they had dissociation of sensibility, since they could not use feeling and emotion, feeling and thinking, emotion and thought together. That was easily handled by metaphysical poets. They could, they could think their feeling, they could feel their thoughts. So then, uh, after H.J.C. Grierson and T.S. Eliot, we have F.R. Lewis. He had a great commentary on them. And then we have new critics in America. They tended to elevate the metaphysical style because they modeled their writing or their ideal poetry, and that was replete with the irony, paradox, and unified sensibility. Again, that unification of sensibility they were using in your writing. Their ideal poetry, the kind of model they had for poetry. So F.R. Lewis is known for his work, Revaluation, Tradition and Development in English Poetry. It was published in 1936. Here we have the information regarding metaphysical poets, the commentary regarding metaphysical poets by F.R. Lewis. And then in New Critics, we have one of them as Clint Brooks. Clint Brooks wrote Modern Poetry and Their Tradition, and it was published in 1939. So some concepts that were left in previous slides. One is regarding this phrase of Dr. Samuel Johnson when he used and made that statement, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. It describes the metaphysical poets like Donne, meaning they forcefully combined wildly different concepts, very dissimilar concepts they used, using and surprising intellectual and sometimes jarring comparisons. That's why here that particular phrase comes into context, metaphysical conceit. So he's talking of metaphysical conceit, how they used it, how they used to very dissimilar things together to create unified but complex poems, how they blended, how they amalgamated to different things together. For example, he took you know uh, similes and metaphors from science, love, religion, and everyday objects. So, very different domains he used altogether. There, in the last paragraph, we have to talk about that dissociation and association of sensibility, the disparity in style that exists between the metaphysical poets of the 16th and early 17th century. So, metaphysical poets belonged to 16th and early 17th century, and they used that unification or association of sensibility. They and I'm quoting here T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot says, constantly amalgamating disparate experience. So they could amalgamate, they could blend these two things together, emotions and uh, thinking, and that was not done by later poets. That's why Eliot says that they were able to express their thoughts through the experience of feeling, while the later poets did not unite their thoughts with their emotive experiences and therefore expressed thoughts separately. So they either used thoughts or they used feeling. One term that was left earlier was that of cavalier poets. Who were they? They were contemporaries of Donne. But how they were different? They were a group of 17th century English courtier poets. Courtier poets means they belong to court. The kind of concepts we have in India regarding Navaratna, nine gems of Akbar's court. Even uh, King Vikramaditya also had nine gems in his court. Kalidas was one of, among them. So, cavalier poets, the courtier poets of 17th century, they were also called sons of Ben, and notable among them were Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, Sir John Suckling, and Thomas Carey. They wrote elegant, witty, and direct lyric poetry, focusing on love, loyalty, and carpe diem philosophy. Carpe diem, you understand? Carpe diem is phrase using, phrase used for to seize a day, to seize a moment. So that's carpe diem. So this was all for today regarding metaphysical poets. I hope I was able to convey. In later videos, we'll talk of metaphysical conceit. Stay tuned. Thank you. Have a nice day.